My name is Amy Wong. I am an artist, an educator, and a parent. I go by she and they pronouns. My family background is that my parents are both from Hong Kong. My mom's from Guangdong. And they both emigrated here like in the 1970s. So my ancestral languages are Taishanese, Toisanwa, and Cantonese. My elevator pitch, I guess, for my practice is that I am an angry Asian feminist disguised as an oil painter. That's always what I say when people just want to know briefly what I do. But essentially, I have a painting-braised interdisciplinary practice that also invites collaboration and kind of mixed media and social practice. And I really think about the sort of politics of making noise or thinking through ideas or having conversations together, and using art as a means or as a vehicle for like challenging or questioning the way that we live and the world that we live in. So I guess in terms of my practice, I'm inspired by multiple systems of representation, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about that later, like the sort of difference between representation and like enunciation or iteration, which is something that I've been thinking about in this piece. My relation to OCAD: when I applied for this show, I was a sessional instructor at OCAD, and I've been teaching here since 2016 in drawing and painting, but also first year, life studies, other kind of departments. And I recently just accepted an offer for assistant professor in drawing and painting, so I'm really excited about that. And yeah, I currently paint and, do all sorts of stuff, but my current research involves thinking intergenerationally and specifically collaborating with my child, my kid. His name is Rudy. He's 7 years old, and we kind of think about the transmission of culture and knowledge through what it is to have intergenerational relationships, but also like thinking about unseen practices of care and like how mothering or mother work can be a form of activism and a call to justice. I think overall my practice is really informed by intersectional feminism, right? So this kind of idea that these multiple identities that we all hold as a diasporic person, as a racialized person, as a queer person, as a parent, and so on, they all reflect larger social kind of situations or histories or cultures and constructs. And so this show for me really talks about everything that I'm interested in, right? This idea of like art as a vehicle for communication, but also just language, right? Like how we frame our thoughts and the form that it takes, right? So form and concept in that relationship, but also a lot of what I think about is, I guess, aspirations towards decolonial or anti-colonial work as a racialized settler, and kind of trying to understand like how I'm implicated within these structures, what I can do about it, how I can use art to have conversations or try to understand something better. And so, yeah, not all of my work is about, what's the word that you use? Cultural heritage. And I think a lot of what my work challenges is like, as racialized folk making artwork, like how do we present that? What is cultural heritage? Who is our intended audience? Who are we making work for? And, you know, how to navigate that, right? So how to use the vehicle of art to kind of think through these ideas, as well as like as forms of resistance, right? So if we're thinking about like coloniality and kind of dominant culture, and the way that this show is talking about kind of like the disappearance of languages. Like from my understanding, there's like a language that is lost every 2 weeks, right? So it's like the fact that our cultures are becoming extinct as an effect of colonialism, right? So how can artwork be a way to like have these conversations about what folks want to like continue or like preserve or resuscitate or center, I guess. The work that I've presented, so there's sort of visual pieces, so there's works on paper, there's a piece on canvas, so they're drawing and paintings, I guess you would say, and then there's also a sound piece, and they all complement each other, but they're all sort of separate pieces as well. And I, as like a painter, I like thinking about like acts of quotation as a way to comment on larger social structures. So the difference between like a reference and a quotation, these sorts of things are really interesting to me, and I think about that as parallels to like language, right? How we can play with language, how it's this living document that is about like enunciations. In the show, there's like a piece on canvas. I believe it's an acrylic on canvas or mixed media on canvas work. It's called The Parable of the Frog, and I was thinking about kind of this sort of kind of gaps in translation or bridges in translation. And so I don't know where this parable comes from, like the Western version of like, if you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, it would jump out. But if you put a frog in a pot of water and like slowly turn on the heat, gradually you can like boil it alive. It's like this kind of tale of like, you know, the lesson being that like if something happens gradually, you won't notice, right? Or you won't notice the harm. And I really think about that in the context of this show, right? This idea of like language is slowly dying, and like if you aren't careful or active in really like being cognizant of what's happening, then, you know, that's it. Like white supremacy is gonna cook us all. So it's this like sort of like pink splayed frog, you know, and I'm really interested in these tensions where it's like, it looks humorous and it's like kind of beautiful, and you're not really sure why the frog is pink as opposed to green. I was also thinking about like a Chinese parable that's like, or proverb about a frog in a well. So if you, it's like an analogy to like a person who is like limited in vision or like unwise, right? Because the frog is in the well and all they see is like, their view is like the top of the well, like this is the world that they see. And so these two sort of like verbal images like kind of combine for me into that painting. And then the drawing works or the painting works on paper are ink and watercolor, I believe, and they're called shady Chinese proverbs. And some of them are based on Chinese proverbs and some of them are not. And it's sort of a play on, you know, these cliches of like fortune cookie culture, right? Like sort of if you're someone on the outside or if you don't have access to a language, like how much, like where's the depth in how you can understand it? And so some of those, I think some of the images are directly from like sayings and proverbs, and some of them are from like other things that are not deliberately like not Chinese proverbs. So can I play one from my mom? I like was trying to ask her, like, give me an example of one. The bodies of work are really about me trying to relearn my heritage language. I asked her this morning and she was like, why didn't you ask me earlier? I don't know if you can hear this. Hold on.
What does that mean?
So the proverb is 杯弓蛇影, right? So as I hear it, I'm trying to also like learn what she's saying. And
杯弓即係你隻杯
yeah,
嗰個 handle，
uh,
有時睇落好似條蛇咁樣，即係啲話啲人好似you know， 即係你要 imagining things。
Oh, that's a good one. So this is sort of an example of like how we speak at home, right? So the language is mixed. It's a bit of English, it's a bit of Canto, and what she's describing is like, it's like for one who's like looking at the handle of a cup, but seeing like, I think the shadow or the image of a snake. So this idea of like, you're like making things up or you're imagining things. And you know, like all through growing up, she would say certain things, like my dad would do it too, where they would be like, oh, there's this saying in Chinese, and like as the kids we wouldn't understand it and they would have to break it down and then like tell us like what each word meant, what the kind of moral of the phrase or the teaching was. And so I sort of took that as a starting point, but there's also like really like shady Cantonese sayings that I don't know of in other languages. And so like one of the drawings, for example, like I was thinking about this Cantonese slang for, it's called like if you're saying something like somebody who's dai lok mo, like wearing a green hat, it means that like everyone knows that their partner is cheating on them. So it's like, you know, I think about these things, it's like, how do you represent that? Like, what if you made an image or a drawing of someone wearing a green hat? Who can read that symbolism? Like, who has access to a culture and access to that language? And like, how do we understand certain cultural signifiers? So the drawings are about that. It's really taking inspirations from everywhere. Like some of them are song lyrics. There's one that's like an Arabic saying. I'm going to paraphrase this, but a friend told me that it's something like, you're not even bragging about your sister's hair, like you're bragging about your neighbor's hair. Like this idea that like you're bragging a lot, but it's not even about yourself. And so yeah, I think there's like a lot of kind of mixed influences in there, but those drawings are also really about the concept of code switching. Essentially, it's the idea of like folks from from marginalized cultures existing in like a dominant other culture and then having to like either change the way that they speak or the way that they look or the way that they dress. Here, this is a better... Okay, in linguistics, code switching or language alternation occurs when a speaker alternates between two or more languages or language varieties in the context of a single conversation or situation. Code switching can occur when there is a change in the environment in which one is speaking, or in the context of speaking a different language or switching the verbiage to match that of the audience. So I think that's key, like this kind of expectation of the quote unquote audience or the kind of mainstream culture. And yeah, like as folks who speak languages that are not the dominant languages, for example, it's like, what are examples of code switching linguistically, but also culturally in terms of cultural presentation and how you enact or move in the world, like how do you enact your own identity. So the piece that ties it all together, so it's the cassette that's also like on the flyer for the exhibition, but the cassette, the image of the cassette and the actual object, which is in the exhibition, is the only document that I know of where it's a recording of myself between the ages of 2 and 4 years old, and I'm speaking my heritage language. So I'm speaking Cantonese and thinking in the language, which I cannot do now. So now when I speak Canto, I have to like translate it from English in my head. So there's a sort of gap that happens before like the words come out of your mouth. And so when I hear this, it's like this encountering of like another person almost, right? So there's a lot of, like, although it seems really light because you hear a child's voice in it, you know, there's a lot of kind of diasporic grief and like really witnessing this sense of loss. And so how do I take this document and kind of learn or relearn or unlearn from it? And so there's 2 audio clips, one for each side of the document. There's 2 audio recordings, and one represents each side of the cassette. And so on the first side, I'm 2 years old. You know, I'm telling a story with my mom. Like I remember it when I hear it. It's like I'm flipping through this storybook, which is like the kind of Chinese equivalent to Are You My Mother? I don't know if you know this book, but it's like of a swan baby like looking for its mother. And so there's something about this kind of like search for its own identity that I think is a really interesting parallel. I'm like bossing my sister around, you know, I'm singing songs. And the thing about these audio recordings is like everyone in my family is in it. So on this side, it's like my sister's in it. My dad's singing, you know, karaoke at some point in it. You know, my mom's reading with me, but also you hear like sounds in the background, like her smashing garlic with like a butcher knife, which to me is like so Chinese. Like when I hear this sound, right? And, you know, as a kid, I'm responding to everything in the environment. I'm having conversations with myself. It's a sort of like sound art, and I think it was just a way for me at the time to like keep myself occupied. But just like hearing that, I started to use the recording as a sort of écouter, répéter. I don't know if you folks had this in school, but when I was a kid growing up, they would play these French cassettes like during French class, where they would like say a phrase, then stop the cassette, and then you were supposed to repeat it, right? So copy and repeat. And so the first side is really kind of side A is like getting to know my own voice and to learn how to speak. So I'm doing écouter, répéter with myself. And then the second side is a bit more pivotal or a little bit more experimental, where at that point I'm like 4.5, and I've just started school. So you can sort of hear the difference in how I'm speaking. You know, the first side, when I'm 2 years old, I'm mostly speaking in Cantonese. And then on the second side, it's a bit more pivotal, where like I don't really understand English yet, but because I'm surrounded by this world and I've just started school, I start narrating storybooks, but pretending that I'm speaking in English and then translating it back to Cantonese for like this imagined audience. But I don't actually fully understand the English, so there's like there's these moments where I'm like, oh, it's like run, run, run to a branch, a blush, blah. Like I'm just making up English like sounds or phonetics of what I'm thinking to be English. And so in the recording on the second side, I start to quote like a lot of critical theorists, and specifically in that moment, I'm also thinking about the history of like the ethnic slurs like Ching Chong, which, were a way to like degrade and make fun of the Chinese, Mandarin and Cantonese. And so one of the thinkers that I've quoted on the second side, there's folks like Walter Mignolo, Bell Hooks, Sylvia Rivera Kuzakanchi, Eve Tuck, Stuart Hall. So a lot of kind of thinkers who are talking about language, communication, history, and coloniality. Walter Mignolo talks about decoloniality as a process of delinking, right? And so if you're talking about representation, that's actually a key word in the rhetoric of mainstream Western epistemology, right? So when we're representing something, there is this, like, if we're thinking about like modernity and like the understanding of representation, it's like there's this like assumption that there's ontologically like a thing to be represented, right? So this idea of like a neutral or like as like that, like an object to be represented, right? Whereas if we think about enunciation, and I think about this in parallel to like speaking, like enunciating or iterating, then there is a possibility of thinking decolonially, because we are then asserting that, that we live in a world that is constantly invented in every enunciation, right? And so that connects to, pedagogies of like storytelling and narrative, and that there isn't this like objective or neutral, but like that we're always creating the world that we're living in. And there's a sort of kind of empowering active component in that. And so it's like I'm kind of thinking about all this critical theory, but it's also interspersed with like the way that I'm speaking as a child. My kid is in it. There's segments where I'm like asking him why he doesn't want to go to Chinese school, and it's like he's repeating this cycle, like a kind of next cycle of like the loss of language that I feel, because he doesn't speak Cantonese at all. My little brother is in there with like a clip, and like even within a generation, for example, I'm the eldest. I speak the most Cantonese, my sister less, and like my brother the least. So like when I listen to the audio of like even my mother reading stories to me, she's never read to her grandchildren or spoken to them in Cantonese because they don't understand it. And so, I think about these clips as almost like thinking about time as like not linear, but how can we use sound as a way to link the past and the present, and to think of time as more circular, right? So it's not just like we lose something, but we lose something, we can get it back, we can change it. Culture is this mutable thing that in its enunciation. I first came up with the concept of this audio piece, this idea of learning from my own voice, I would say about 20 years ago when I was in undergrad. And I did a performance of it before making this audio version, but then recently I had discovered an episode of the podcast Code Switch, where it talks about the loss of the Hawaiian language because of forces of colonialism, and it was an episode of speakers, a group of speakers. The language was almost gone, and speakers who were learning the language and built a school to then teach future generations the Hawaiian language as they were learning it. So I really recommend you folks check that out. I'm always at OCAD. You can find me here.